On June 1, Mexico held its first judicial elections, following a sweeping overhaul of the judiciary enacted by the Mexican Congress last year. Now, nearly 7,000 judges, including on the Supreme Court, are popularly elected, a drastic change from the previous system, which drew candidates from the civil service. Critics, as well as Tony Payan, director of our Center for the U.S. and Mexico, say this move doesn't really fix Mexico's rule of law issues, and in fact will make the courts more vulnerable to corruption. A couple of weeks ago, Tony and I talked about not just this issue, but a whole host of matters facing Mexico and its relationship with the United States. Some of these are tied to the specific inclinations of the Donald Trump administration. For example, how Mexico is approaching U.S. tariffs, the future of the trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, whose extension under Trump is in question. But most of the core challenges facing Mexico under President Claudia Sheinbaum are long-standing ones. The problem of cartels and organized crime, both at the border and as they relate to public safety inside Mexico. The growing fiscal liability posed by the state-owned oil firm Pemex and the country's nationalist energy policies, and the increasing reality of drought, and what it means for Mexico's ability to meet the demands of its water-sharing agreement with the United States, just to name a few. We're splitting our conversation into 2 episodes, with the second one coming next week. Here's part 1, covering some of the more internal challenges shaping Sheinbaum's agenda, including judicial reforms, the future of public safety in Mexico, and the fiscal deficit. Next week's episode will cover U.S.-Mexican issues more broadly. Thanks for tuning in. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. To remind listeners, September last year, the Mexican Congress enacted a very sweeping constitutional judicial reform mandating popular election of nearly 7,000 judges, including the Supreme Court, replacing the previous merit-based appointment system. Critics have argued that this threatens judicial independence. It exposes judges to extraordinary political pressure and potential influence from organized crime. This is a very topical subject because in just 2 weeks, there's going to be an election, the first judicial election in Mexico, June 1. Tony, what does this mean?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake. Most people think it's a mistake. Most companies that are seeking to invest in Mexico have entered a period of uncertainty because they don't know whether the newly elected judges in the fall will actually be acting on the basis of knowledge, merit, competence, technical competence to make decisions, or whether the directive is going to be a lot of folks that are questionable in their technical capacity, that are able to make neutral decisions based on the law, whether they're not political or whether they're too politicized because they were elected. And even whether some of them, because there's evidence that a good percentage of these candidates are actually also engaged in criminal activities or facilitating crime, and some of them are lawyers for organized criminals, and some of them may themselves be questionable and have been engaged in criminal activity. So I think that's an issue. I don't think that the judicial system is something that ought to be that radically democratized. I think there is a level of technical competence that is required, and I think this system is not going to provide it. The other issue, I think, important on that, it's not just that it makes the judicial system more vulnerable to corruption, political corruption, and of course the influence of organized crime and other dark interests, but also the fact that I think there really is no other precedent in the world except Bolivia. I think this was something that was taken by the Morena party out of Bolivia. I think when it comes to the administration of justice and the rule of law in Mexico, you have a whole chain where there are many different links. There's obviously investigations, prosecution, defense, judges, and on and on. So it's a process. And I think in Mexico, to change the judges and the circuit judges and the magistrates of the Supreme Court to being elected doesn't fix the whole chain that requires attention to implement a true rule of law in Mexico. There are no more resources for prosecutions. There are no more resources and training for public defenders, for lawyers. There isn't any mechanisms to defend the judicial system from influence and penetration by organized crime. The whole chain, I think, is not equipped. It doesn't fix anything. And I think the only thing that this particular election fixes is something that probably didn't need fixing. It wasn't that urgent to change the judicial system at the very end of the rule of law chain, which is the judges. We needed to address the whole chain.
But Tony, the purpose of all of this was never to fix. It was to place judges under direct political party control, wasn't it?
Yes, I think that they certainly control the executive branch in the Morena party. They now control the Congress. We have to remember that the way they got control of Congress in Mexico was they got 54% of the vote. And by some obscure formula, they ended up adjudicating to themselves 74% of the seats in Congress. I guess this was technically right, but it was certainly not a mandate. And it was not a mandate to make 20 different changes to the Constitution.
Supermajority.
Exactly, a supermajority that enabled them to change the regime in Mexico without having really the votes. So they did it by obviously some things like saying, oh, we're not going to assign the proportional representation seats by coalition because we got 54%, we're going to assign them by party. And obviously that was a three-party coalition, so they distributed the seats in such a way that they got 74%. And now I think their objective is to control the judiciary as well. So my guess is that the long-term political project is to reestablish a one-party rule in Mexico.
Well, Tony, this gets us to a fundamental question, which we've discussed before, which is to what extent is she able to break free of the shadow of López Obrador and the Morena party, which is not under her direct control, but that of López Obrador's son?
Yes, this is a big question in Mexico. Where is Mr. López Obrador?
Literally, where is he?
We do not know. And some folks argue that he's in Cuba. Some others argue that he's in his ranch down in southern Mexico. Some argue that he's hiding in the National Palace. Nobody knows. It's just rampant speculation by the media and people. I don't think that the issue is so much that he's directly influencing the president. I think that the president is a believer in López Obradorismo, so to speak. So I think that many of her inclinations were shaped by him, pre-directed by him, and I think she has certainly shown that she's a faithful disciple of López Obrador. So I don't even think that he has to have a direct hand in influencing policy or the things that she says. I think she's well-trained, and she has certainly shown that she has the same authoritarian impulses of the López Obrador administration. She's fully bound by the political project that he started, backsliding of democracy, the election of federal judges and magistrates of the Supreme Court. So she's essentially working on the same agenda. We'll see when she breaks free from that.
Now, Tony, she has made some changes on the national security front. She's rejected unilateral U.S. military activity, but she's made a shift, hasn't she, between reliance on the military as the arm of either collaboration or confrontation with the cartels. And she shifted it to a trusted aide, Omar Garcia Harfuch, who heads the intelligence and sort of domestic security services, not the military. What does this mean?
Well, we have to remember, I think, that Mr. López Obrador heavily militarized and centralized the security apparatus because I think it was a way for him to fully control how much cartels were confronted. He created the National Guard. I don't know exactly how many individuals there are in the National Guard. At some point, there were 80,000, but the objective was to get them to be 120,000. And then they passed a constitutional reform placing the National Guard directly under the command of the armed forces, specifically the Army. Now, to me, Harfuch has a problem, although she trusts him. I think he's one of the closest people to her, and she has certainly given him a mandate to address the issue of organized crime. But the problem is you have a National Guard with roughly 100,000 guards, so to speak. We don't know if they're cops or soldiers because they're under the command of the armed forces, but they're not going to pay attention to Omar Garcia Harfuch. They are directly under the command of the military. And they seem to be very passive. They don't seem to be very active right now, and that, I think you're absolutely right. And then on the other hand, you got the Secretariat for Security, public security, Omar Garcia Harfuch, who's got only 12,000 agents. That's 1/10 practically of what the National Guard has. He has very few resources. He's certainly got the intelligence apparatus, but we don't know, because the Army has its own intelligence agency, we don't know how much they're collaborating.
Tony, what's the opening here, if you see one, for the United States to augment Harfuch's ability to function, whether jointly or by providing him with actionable information? Is there a win-win out here?
Yes, when I've been to Washington, D.C. the last couple of times and I met with Congress members, he is certainly dear to them. They know Omar Garcia Harfuch. They've been to Mexico City. He's received them. He's talked to them. And they really believe that he can make a difference, that he is a true cop, so to speak, that he's a true policeman, an agent that can certainly work with the United States. I think this is an opening. Where's the Mexico team in Washington, D.C.? You see a Canada team, for example. The Mexico team is nowhere to be found. Omar Garcia Harfuch, I think, is the closest figure to developing intimate, close relationships with members of the political elite in Washington, D.C. That's an opportunity for Washington. I think it's also an opportunity for Ms. Sheinbaum and for him to see if they can attract interest, some sort of collaboration, resources from the United States. I don't know how many resources Trump is going to put on the table for that, by the way. Trump, I think, clearly believes that this is something that Mexico must resolve and pay for. He doesn't necessarily think that this is something that Washington has to pay for. But Congress members are a different thing. They may be able to work something for him. The idea here is how much, I guess, Ms. Sheinbaum is going to allow Washington, the DA in this case, and other agencies to gather intelligence in Mexico and to collaborate, and whether these operations are going to be under the charge of Mr. Garcia Harfuch directly or they're going to be joint operations. That's still to be determined. Ron Johnson, who was just sworn in, the new American ambassador to Mexico, I think has that very much in mind. And I think one of his first items on the list will be to work out an arrangement to do minimally binational action, and if not, force the Trump administration with unilateral actions, which I think would be a disaster.
The energy sector in Mexico. Tony, Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, is a basket case. It's the state-owned oil company. It has liabilities exceeding $100 billion. It's been bailed out multiple times by the Mexican government, but it's a fiscal risk. It's an albatross, low production, inefficient, limited exploration investment. Now, part of that's Pemex, but it is also the product of Mexican energy policies, most of which remain firmly nationalist, statist, rooted in theories of ownership of petroleum resources that emerged in the 1950s. Without structural reform, strategic policy reform, this is going to be an unsustainable burden. And it is a non-productive use of extraordinary hydrocarbon resources that Mexico produces. What do you see as the future here?
I think, unfortunately, ideologically, Mexico is stuck in the past. I do not see the Morena party and this governing coalition at this moment willing to make any serious reforms to the energy sector. In fact, they just pushed forward with the power law, essentially reversing the liberalization of the previous power law from a few years ago. So they're re-centralizing that. For some reason in Mexico, I think energy is so wrapped up in nationalism. There's this strange mix of energy and nationalism. I think it began with oil, but it also extends to gas. It extends to electricity to some extent. So I don't see that the government is willing to do it. The government is going to be, for the next few years, I think, willing to continue to rescue Pemex. Obviously, oil production is dropping. Mexico has had several regional blackouts recently because it does not have the power generation and it does not have the money to invest in the distribution of that power throughout the country to take full advantage of the manufacturing that is going on in Mexico. Expansion for companies is really very difficult right now. The electricity is simply not there, and Mexico is dependent on Texas gas. I think about 65 to 70% of its natural gas is imported from Texas. And that fuels Mexican manufacturing and some power production. So the energy sector in Mexico is just completely irrational, and it is really compromising the fiscal situation of Mexico in the future. To be able to rescue Pemex, to be able to continue the entitlement programs that were created by the López Obrador administration and have been sustained by the Sheinbaum administration. I think Mexico is now having to borrow in their international markets, and the national debt has gone up from some 45-46% of GDP to about 56. It's going to approach 60% very soon. And obviously, lenders, international lenders, will begin to ask questions about whether this money is being invested in productive capacity for the future or is just simply being wasted by subsidizing Pemex, CFE, the power company, and these programs that lead nowhere. I think Mexico is getting into a fiscal situation that is not going to be very sustainable and can very easily lead to another tequila crisis or another tortilla crisis, whatever you want to call them, the crises that occurred in Mexico in the 70s, 80s, and of course 94, which was the last serious fiscal and financial crisis that Mexico had.
We talked prior to President Sheinbaum's election about the bombs ticking under the presidential chair. And the biggest one of those bombs was the fact that López Obrador had spent through the quite extraordinary resources which Mexico possessed when he came into office through his populist program. The money isn't there. Credit exists in the international markets for the moment, but the cash isn't in reserves in Mexico. Minus a credible structural and ideological reform to how energy resources can be developed at all. And I remind the listeners, the Permian Basin extends well into Mexico, but has never been tapped. The immovable object, the ideology of Mexico, not just Morena, and the irresistible force, fiscal reality, are going to collide.
Yeah, certainly. And I think they will collide sooner than we think. I think very quickly, in just a couple of years, most of us predict that by 26, 27, President Sheinbaum is going to face a very serious fiscal crisis. She's going to have to cut the entitlement programs to young folks, to elderly, to single mothers, to students, and on that they created. Because there's a couple of things that I think are serious. You know how easy it is to create an entitlement program and how difficult it is to take it away. When people in Mexico begin to see that their deposit by the Mexican government, $200, $300, $400 a month, is simply not coming into their checking account or their debit account, they're going to get mad and they're going to ask questions about why the government has suddenly cut that particular benefit, that particular entitlement program. And I think she will have a political crisis in her hands, but with nowhere to go to solve it, because the economy grew at 0.6% per annum under the López Obrador administration, and it is at minus 0.3% in the last quarter of 25, which means the Mexican economy is flat on its back.
Tony, if you had López Obrador in a room and you asked him the question, Mr. President, what was your plan for the next 5, the next 10 years, given the exhaustion of Mexico's fiscal resources, what do you think he would tell you?
Well, I think he would simply say, look, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I don't care. This is a matter of distributing the resources the country has now, handing out the cash, handing out the money, helping poor people, helping folks with some kind of subsidy, and then leave it to the next government.
Let the future take care of itself.
That's right.
And now the future is here.
The future is here. It's in Sheinbaum's hands. It is a hot potato, and she's going to have to deal with it, and I think sooner than she thinks.
Next week's episode, part 2 of my conversation with Tony, will cover major issues in Mexico's relationship with the United States. Tony and I talk about how Sheinbaum is handling President Trump's particular style of governance, the border and narco trafficking, immigration, and the issue of water sharing amid increasing drought, a growing problem for the two governments, as well as farmers and ranchers on both sides of the border. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thanks for listening.